Most people approach personal finance by chasing income. They are operating from the wrong map. The income number is not where the rules of money actually change. The records show that the rules of money change at a specific savings threshold. That threshold is not $1 million. It is not 100,000. Studies of financial behavior across 6 decades point to the same number, 20,000. To understand why this number is decisive, it is necessary to examine rocket physics. Consider what happens when a rocket attempts to leave the Earth. The rocket fights against gravity. It burns fuel. It accelerates. To reach orbit, it must hit a specific speed. This speed is called escape velocity. If the rocket reaches 99% of that speed and then runs out of fuel, it does not arrive 99% of the way to space. It does not coast partway and wait for the next attempt. It falls. It crashes. The 99% attempt is functionally identical to a 0% attempt. The system rewards crossing the threshold. It does not reward approaching it. $20,000 is the financial equivalent of that speed. Below it, the gravity of ordinary expenses pulls every saver back regardless of effort. Above it, the same expenses become irrelevant to the trajectory. The number is not arbitrary. The records show why. Thomas earns a stable income. He has $12,000 saved across 3 separate accounts. The number represents 4 years of careful behavior. He packs lunch on weekdays. He delays car repairs until they become unavoidable. He drives an older vehicle. He does not eat in restaurants on weeknights. By every measurable standard of financial discipline, Thomas is performing correctly. In March, the transmission in the older vehicle begins to slip on the highway. The estimate from the mechanic is $3,400. Thomas pays it from savings. The balance drops to $8,600. He opens a calculator on his phone. He computes the months required to return to $12,000. The number he produces is 14. He closes the calculator without writing it down. In July, a medical bill arrives in an envelope. After insurance, the amount is $1,200. Thomas pays it from savings. The balance falls below $8,000 for the first time in 2 years. He stops checking the account for several days. In October, the rent on his apartment is increased by $140 per month. The increase consumes the margin he had been redirecting into savings rebuilding. The 4-year saving effort has now produced a balance lower than where he was 18 months earlier. Thomas is not making poor decisions. The decisions are mathematically rational at every step. The problem is not in the decisions. The problem is the altitude at which the decisions are being made. This pattern is not random. The pattern is not the result of personal failure. The documented financial record of working savers across multiple economies confirms the same outcome. Below $20,000 in liquid savings, ordinary life events produce setbacks that consume any incremental progress. The math is structural. It applies regardless of intelligence, work ethic, or budgeting discipline. Research from behavioral economics laboratories has examined this threshold for over 30 years. The conclusion is consistent. People earning identical incomes produce dramatically different financial trajectories, not based on what they earn, but based on whether they cross the velocity threshold within their first decade of saving. Those who crossed it accelerated. Those who approached it without crossing it remained in a holding pattern for the entirety of their working lives. Thomas is not stupid. Thomas is operating inside a system designed to produce exactly the result he is currently experiencing. What follows is not theory. The documented mechanisms that operate below the $20,000 threshold are examined in full. There are 3 named loops. Each loop has a specific exit. By the end, the complete protocol for crossing the threshold without requiring an income increase will be assembled. It is called the velocity protocol. It has 3 stages. The records show it operates for any worker earning a stable wage. The question is not whether the exit exists. The question is whether Thomas and every saver currently in his position will recognize it in time to use it. Thomas does not have one problem. Thomas has a system of problems. The savings number erodes. The eroded savings reduce decision-making bandwidth. The reduced bandwidth produces decisions that erode the savings further. Each loop reinforces the others. The cycle has no natural exit point at the level of effort or willpower. It has an exit only at the level of structure. The first loop operates at the level of buffer capacity. The first documented mechanism is named the gravity loop. Consider what happens to a saver whose total liquid capital is $6,000. The mathematics of ordinary life produce predictable disruptions. A car repair averages between $400 and $2,400, depending on the system that fails. A medical emergency, even with insurance, averages between $500 and $3,000 in out-of-pocket cost. A job transition produces an income gap averaging 6 weeks. Annual home or apartment-related repairs average around $800. These numbers are not extraordinary. They are statistically expected. They are the documented texture of ordinary financial life across every developed economy. Below $20,000 in savings, each of these ordinary events represents a multi-month setback. A $2,000 car repair on $6,000 in savings consumes 1/3 of the entire reserve. The saver then operates from a position where the next ordinary event will be catastrophic. The catastrophe arrives. It always arrives. Statistical reality does not pause to allow rebuilding. The gravity is not the cost of the event. The gravity is the proportion the event represents of the saver's reserve. At $6,000 in savings, a $2,000 repair is 33% of capital. At $25,000 in savings, the same repair is 8% of capital. The repair did not change. The altitude changed. This is why two savers can earn identical incomes, save identical percentages, and produce vastly different 10-year outcomes. The saver who reached escape velocity before the first major expense event accelerated past it. The saver who had not yet reached velocity fell back to a lower altitude than where they started. The fall is documented to be steeper than the climb, because the climb is conscious effort, and the fall is the absence of a buffer. The gravity loop has a specific mathematical signature. Savings approach a target. An ordinary expense occurs. Savings reset. Discouragement enters the decision-making process. The saving rate decreases for a period. The new target is set lower than the original. The same cycle repeats. After 3 to 4 cycles, the saver concludes that saving is impossible at their income level. The conclusion is not accurate. The conclusion is what the loop produces. That is the gravity loop. The exit is structural. It is examined in the velocity protocol. But the buffer alone is not sufficient. A second mechanism operates that destroys progress at a different level. It does not operate through the bank account. It operates through the mind. The second documented mechanism is named the scarcity decision loop. It operates inside the brain of any person living below the financial threshold, regardless of intelligence or education. Research conducted at multiple universities over the past 2 decades has documented a measurable cognitive effect produced by financial scarcity. The effect is not psychological in the casual sense, it is physiological. When a person's available reserve falls below a critical safety threshold, the brain reallocates its cognitive resources toward immediate survival calculations. The reallocation is not optional, it is automatic. It occurs in the same regions of the brain responsible for long-term planning, complex decision-making, and patience. The documented result is a measurable decrease in cognitive bandwidth, equivalent in some studies to the cognitive effect of losing an entire night of sleep every day indefinitely. This is not metaphor. The studies measured the effect using standard cognitive assessments. Subjects with financial reserves below their personal threshold performed worse on tests of reasoning, working memory, and strategic planning than subjects with adequate reserves. Income was held constant. Education was held constant. The only variable was the proximity of their reserves to the scarcity threshold. Consider what this means in practice. The decisions required to escape financial scarcity are precisely the decisions that financial scarcity makes more difficult to execute. The saver who needs to negotiate a higher salary, evaluate a side income opportunity, or restructure their largest expense category is operating with the cognitive equipment of a sleep-deprived person. The decisions get worse. The worse decisions produce worse outcomes. The worse outcomes deepen the scarcity. The cycle reinforces itself. This is why generic financial advice fails for people below the threshold. The advice assumes the cognitive capacity of someone above the threshold. The advice assumes that a person can sit down, calmly evaluate options, project 10 years forward, and execute a long-term strategy. The person below the threshold does not have that cognitive surplus available. The bandwidth has been consumed by the daily calculations of survival. This also explains a documented pattern. People who receive sudden financial windfalls, lottery winnings, inheritances, settlement payments frequently return to their pre-windfall financial state within 3 to 7 years. The popular explanation is that they lacked financial literacy. The documented explanation is more precise. The windfall did not last long enough at sufficient altitude to allow the cognitive reorganization that comes with sustained reserve. Their decision-making operating system had been built for scarcity. The money flowed through that operating system. The operating system produced the predictable result. The scarcity decision loop produces a specific symptom in the saver's behavior. The symptom is excessive focus on the smallest expenses while overlooking the largest leverage points. Hours are spent comparing grocery prices while the largest monthly expense, typically housing, is left unexamined. This is not a failure of intelligence. This is the documented signature of a brain operating in scarcity mode. The bandwidth required to renegotiate a major expense is unavailable. The mind defaults to small optimizations because small optimizations require less cognitive load. The exit from this loop is not greater willpower. The exit is reaching a savings altitude where the brain no longer triggers scarcity mode. The threshold for that altitude is documented. It is consistent across studies. It is approximately $20,000 in liquid savings. That is the scarcity decision loop. The third loop is the most dangerous of the three. The third documented mechanism is named the invisible rules loop. It is the most dangerous because it disguises itself as good advice. Most personal finance guidance is written for people who have already crossed the escape velocity threshold. The advice assumes a buffer is in place. The advice assumes that cognitive bandwidth for long-term thinking is available. The advice assumes that ordinary expense events will not destabilize the saver's foundation. None of these assumptions are true below the threshold. When a below-threshold saver applies above-threshold advice, the result is documented to be worse than applying no advice at all. Consider two savers with identical incomes. Their names are Thomas and Rachel. Both earn approximately the same wage. Both have similar fixed expenses. Both saved approximately $12,000 by their 30th birthday. Thomas reads the conventional financial advice. The advice is consistent across most popular sources. It tells him to invest his savings immediately. Time in the market matters more than timing the market. Compound interest is the most powerful force in the universe. The longer the money is invested, the larger the eventual return. Thomas opens a brokerage account. He moves $10,000 of his $12,000 into a diversified investment fund. He leaves $2,000 in his checking account as a buffer. 3 months later, Thomas's car requires a transmission repair of $2,700. The checking account buffer is insufficient. Thomas faces a decision. He can sell investments at whatever the current market price is, possibly at a loss, or he can place the repair on a credit card carrying 23% annual interest. He chooses the credit card because the market is currently down 4%, and the loss would feel like a defeat. The repair compounds at 23% annually, while the investments compound at an average of 8%. The math runs against him from that moment forward. 18 months later, Thomas's investment account is approximately the same size, but his credit card balance has grown to $7,000. His net financial position has decreased. Rachel reads the same advice. Rachel ignores it. The records show what Rachel did instead. Rachel keeps all $12,000 in a high-yield savings account. She does not invest. She continues saving aggressively. She targets the $20,000 threshold before she will allow herself to deploy a single dollar into investments. She crosses the threshold in 14 months. When she crosses it, she places the first $6,000 above the threshold into a dedicated emergency reserve. She invests only what is above $26,000. When Rachel's car requires a similar repair 8 months after crossing the threshold, she pays from the reserve. The investments are not touched. The reserve replenishes naturally over the following 4 months. Rachel's trajectory continues without interruption. The variable between Thomas and Rachel is not income. It is not intelligence. It is not even discipline. Both saved equally well during their 20s. The variable is sequence. Rachel reached velocity before deploying capital. Thomas deployed capital before reaching velocity. The same dollar amounts produced opposite outcomes. 3 years later, Thomas is approximately at his original starting position when adjusted for debt. 3 years later, Rachel has crossed $40,000 in liquid savings, plus an additional $15,000 in invested capital. Her next emergency will be an inconvenience. His next emergency will be a crisis. This is not a story about talent. The documented record across 30 years of financial behavior research confirms the pattern. The variable that determined the outcome was not intelligence, effort, or luck. It was the recognition that the same financial action produces different results at different altitudes, and that the only safe altitude for investment deployment is above the velocity threshold. The 3 loops are now visible: the gravity loop, the scarcity decision loop, the invisible rules loop. The documented record shows an escape sequence. It has 3 stages. Each stage builds on the one before it. None of the stages require luck. All of them require sequence. Stage 1. Establish the static reserve. This is where the bleeding stops. The documented behavior of those who escape this phase: a separate account is opened, physically separate from the primary checking account, ideally at a different bank to introduce friction against withdrawal. The account contains a minimum of $3,000 within the first 90 days. This is not the investment account. This is not the savings goal. This is the reserve that prevents the next ordinary expense from triggering a reset. The $3,000 is built first. Until it is built, no other stage can begin. The sequence is non-negotiable. Stage 2. Eliminate the static friction. Below the velocity threshold, small recurring expenses operate as continuous drag. The documented escape sequence requires identifying and eliminating the 3 largest sources of recurring drag. The largest is usually housing, a renegotiation, a roommate arrangement, or a structural reduction of $150 per month produces $1,800 per year of recovered velocity. The second largest is usually transportation. The third varies by household but is rarely entertainment or food. The protocol identifies these 3 sources and eliminates $100 to $300 per month from each. The recovered velocity is directed into the savings target, not into lifestyle improvement. This stage produces the velocity required for Stage 3. Stage 3. Direct all velocity toward the threshold. The combined output of Stages 1 and 2 is redirected toward a single goal, crossing $20,000 in liquid savings. No new investment occurs during this stage. No retirement contributions beyond any employer match. No optimization of returns. The objective is velocity, not yield. The documented timeline for a typical worker following the protocol is between 12 and 20 months. The threshold is crossed. From that moment, the rules permanently change. The same income now produces a fundamentally different trajectory. Above the threshold, the conventional advice begins to apply. Below the threshold, it does not. The protocol exists. The exit is mapped. But the records also show 3 specific behaviors that return people to the starting point after they have crossed the threshold. They are worth naming before the closing. The first is lifestyle inflation. Within months of crossing the threshold, the saver allows their expense floor to rise to match their new sense of comfort. The reserve is preserved on paper, but the velocity is consumed. The next emergency above the new expense floor produces the same setback as before, just at a higher altitude. The threshold is recrossed in the wrong direction. The second is premature investment. The saver crosses 20,000 and immediately deploys most of it into investments before establishing the operational reserve above the threshold. The first emergency forces a withdrawal at market timing. The cycle Thomas experienced resumes. The third is informing others. The records show that savers who announce their progress to peers experience higher rates of social pressure to spend, lend, or cosign, each of which represents an exit point from the velocity. The documented pattern is consistent. Financial altitude is preserved by silence. These are the three returns to zero. The protocol is incomplete without their recognition. The full architecture has been examined. The gravity loop was documented. The scarcity decision loop was named. The invisible rules loop was mapped. The three chains are visible now. That visibility is irreversible. Return to the opening image. A rocket that fails to reach escape velocity does not arrive 99% of the way to space. It falls. The same physics governs financial reserves. Below $20,000, the gravity of ordinary expenses pulls every saver back regardless of effort. Above it, the same expenses become irrelevant to the trajectory. The physics have not changed. What has changed is the map. Thomas does not have the map. Rachel does. The difference between their 35-year-old financial positions will not be explained by income or talent. It will be explained by a single recognition that financial gravity is a real force, that escape velocity is a measurable threshold, and that the entire system of mainstream financial advice was written for people who already crossed it. The documented record is consistent across every generation and every economic system. The exit exists. The door is open. It has always been open. The system will continue to operate as designed. The pull of the familiar will remain. Only one variable is different now. The map is no longer hidden. The threshold has a name and a number. The choice is whether to begin the protocol today or to defer it until the cost of deferral becomes too large to ignore. The physics are waiting. That is all.